Hi, my name's Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor, a supervisor, and an EMDR practitioner. And I'd like to spend a bit of time today explaining how we might use transactional analysis or TA therapy to assist someone with abandonment issues. So basically, TA, and I will give the most, because it's only a short video, I'll just give the simplest explanation of it. There's obviously some great books written about it, but the simplest explanation is that our process is built of three parts, and I'll use these dolls to represent those parts. So the first part we would call the parent part, say the biggest doll. Now this part isn't how you parent others, although that will be a function of the parent, but it's predominantly how you parent yourself. So if this part is working well, it will be reassuring you, it will your self-esteem, it will be regulating your diet, it will be telling you to brush your teeth before you go to bed. It will be just making sure you're okay and you're looking after yourself because that's what a parent does, So this part would be replicating. So if for any reason you didn't have, some good modeling when you were a child or you were traumatized or, something happened during your developmental phase, this part of your process might not be good enough to meet the needs of what the internal parent needs to do, which means you might struggle regulating certain, patterns of behavior or impulses. So then we've got the next doll, which would be the middle-sized one, which is we would call the adult. Now the adult part of our process is logic driven. So if you're 30 years old, it's going to act 30 years old. It's also got a lot of ego function in there, so it's confident. It knows what it knows what it is, it knows its power, it knows its stuff, and it won't be manipulated or controlled into believing something different. The anger will come in and say, no, I know I'm okay with this, because if this is working healthily, it will work healthily in those reasons. It will have healthy ego function. It will have anger as present, but not as a volatile anger of throwing all your dolls out the pram. It will have anger there to enough to empower a boundary to say no, that's not me. I know what I'm doing is right here. It's a moral. It's sort of driven by morals and ethics. Is the adult, and then we've got the child part of our personality, which is like all of the emotional systems, and typically a lot of how we've been brought up will be reflected in our behaviors if we regress to a child position. So typically, when we're dealing with people who are traumatized, quite often the egogram we're looking at is that these two parts have sort of gone offline. So the parent isn't able to regulate mood or calm the frightened child down or anything like that, because if there's no parent there is going to be no calming, there's going to be no regulation of feelings. And if the adult has also gone offline, you're not going to be able to think logically about stuff. You're not going to be able to challenge projections. You're not going to be able to say, hold on a minute, you know is that what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling actually real? Is there a real threat in this situation? If these two aren't on board, then the child's just going to be in a very child emotional state. So it's going to be very reactive. So when we think about people with sort of abandonment issues, their child obviously has been abandoned or has perceived to have been abandoned at some point in its life or suffered some sort of neglect. And typically people with abandonment issues can often have have the parent and the adult ego states can often be fluctuating whether they're there at all. Sometimes some people can be very high functioning who have been have abandonment issues, so they might have like a bit more adult sort of in their process, so they can do a good job, so they can do stuff. But typically what they'll be bad at is sort of regulating their emotion. They probably won't be too good in relationships because the parent probably isn't as developed because they were abandoned. So the inner parent probably isn't going to be developed much at all. But often they had to become adults when they were little to sort of survive the situation, figure stuff out. So often with abandoned people, they often have, they can have a big chunk of adult in there, but usually it's the parent that they're lacking. So they can't reassure themselves. They're usually filled with a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of fear around, obviously loss and stuff like that. But there isn't the parent there to sort of regulate that. It's not going to be there. So when we're dealing with people with abandonment issues, what we need to help them do is to grow these two parts of their process, parent and the adult. We need them to start thinking more in those ways, because if not, they're going to stay in their child, and the default is whenever they perceive someone's going to abandon them, they're going to do what the child does. It's going to get angry. It's going to have a tantrum. It might self-harm. It might do something immature because the parent isn't able to regulate. It will try to cope with that emotion by maybe splitting, by dissociating, rather than actually calming its system down with the adult and parent. It's going to do that. So when we're working with people with, abandonment issues, the first thing we teach them is usually to try to grow the adult first, because the parent is usually so split off. There's usually very, very little parent there. They may have the capacity to parent others sometimes, but they certainly won't be able to parent themselves very well. They'll be very insecure, they'll be very vulnerable to shame. So if we can get them to start thinking logically, when they start projecting, when they start feeling that someone's going to abandon them or somebody's thinking bad of them and thinking negative of them, if we can just get them to take a breath in that moment and actually bring the adult in and think, right, okay, my kid's really wanting to react here. I'm feeling really abandoned. I'll feel like running away, or I feel like fighting this person. They're going to be horrible to me. But how can I just slow down my reaction a little bit, analyze it rather than react to it? Because if we can do that, we won't create so much stress hormone. Because often, when the child gets triggered, there's going to be a lot of stress hormone gets thrown into the system that's sort of, because a lot of historical stuff is getting triggered in that same moment, you see. So it's almost like a PTSD response. So if we can actually start, reassuring the child with the adult in a way with logic, so understanding, hopefully we can slow down the cycle of adrenaline production that's making the child even more and more distressed. Because as long as the child keeps believing and ruminating on what's going to happen to it because it's going to be abandoned, then it's going to keep producing more and more stress hormones. So the more logic we can bring in at that point, that might slow down the production of the stress hormone, which makes the world will be a bit more comfortable for the child if we can do that. And then obviously after time, if we can get good at bringing the adult in, then we get better at bringing the parent in, and we get better at offering nurture to ourselves at that point, and of actually if this person abandons us, but we'll be okay. We'll survive. We're not going to, it's not like it was when we were little. We don't have to go through that again. We've got other options now. We can do other stuff. We couldn't when we were a kid. And that's what this part of the brain remembers. You see, this part, when abandonment or it perceives abandonment is going to occur, it's immediately hooked back into that early historical abandonment, and all of those feelings get projected onto the current partner. Now, if we can bring either the parent or the adult in to actually break that cycle of thought, there's a possibility that we'll reduce the levels, of hypervigilance in the child, and they might become a little bit more stable. But it's going to be hard because the child actually has been abandoned at some point, or something's happened that's created that process within itself. So that part of the brain knows it's a possibility. But what that part of the brain is thinking is that I have to feel the same this time if this person abandons me. Now, nothing can be as bad as being abandoned when you're a very tiny child. Nothing can feel that bad when you're an adult, because when you're a tiny little child, it's literally about survival. If you get abandoned, or someone's hostile or cold or not wanting to feed you, you're going to think you're going to die. And that's what the fear of abandonment, behind the fear of abandonment is the fear that what's going to happen if I'm abandoned is death. That's why the defense of abandonment is so massive. It's not just about abandonment. It's because the child part of the brain thinks, my organism, I could die as a person if this person abandons me. So I'll do everything I can to avoid being abandoned by this person, or cling to them, or push them away so I can control the abandonment. Actually, if we can get them start thinking logically and actually analysing the situation and asking, look, hold on a minute, what's the fear about losing this person? Do I need to be that scared? That would be an adult way of challenging the child. So do I need to be that scared? A parent interaction there will be saying, we'll be okay. If we lose this person, we'll find someone else, or we'll be okay for a while. We've got friends. So there's different ways we can respond to our process. But remember, when we get triggered into the abandonment issue, those two parts of our process have gone. So all we've got is the abandoned child. So there isn't a way to think adult or parent in that moment. So what we do when we're working with people with these issues with TA, the more and more we can familiarize them with the process and talk to them about the parent and adult, really hammer it home, the likelihood of them eventually being able to step into an adult or a parent role sometime when they're ruminating, I think increases the more theory we discuss with them. So actually what we're doing when we're helping the abandoned child in therapy, or, a friend who goes into this position, what we're doing is we're trying to access the logical parts of the brain, and we're trying to model that in a way that will help them to do it on their own at some point. And the more that they can do that, the more they can maybe fend away the historical, feelings that are getting triggered by the situation. And this is, like I say, it's a very brief overview of TA and how we would apply it, to an abandoned child in this position. An abandoned child, of course, has grown up to be an adult. But we'll do further, videos on this model, just because it is so important when you're working with people. Really, if you can get people to really inhabit their parent and their adult, they will change how they feel in the world. The neural pathways, there is capacity for change there if you can get people to sort of really think differently in the moment when we're triggered. Whether it isn't about abandonment, maybe it's about something else that's triggering, like a fear response in somebody is, frightened of annihilation all of the time. If this parent and the adult can be more logical in that situation and make that child believe, hold on a minute, I'm not going to be killed in this situation, the likelihood is very minimum. Of course, the terrified child who's scared of being killed, not abandoned, has also lost the parent and the adult, so there are lots of ways that we can apply TA. And so it really is just a more adult and parent thinking we can help people to get into that. So that means us not actually being their parent. That's us modeling ways that they can parent themselves. Because if we just take over the parent role, the child is going to be dependent on us to do all of that. We've got to work towards helping them to build their own parent, their own adult. And that's done by modeling, patience. There are ways, and I'll explain more in further videos. I don't want to make videos too long, too complex. So I think I'll do them all in bite-sized chunks, and let's see how we go. Well, thanks for that. And if you liked it, please subscribe, hit the like button and pass it on to someone else if you think it's useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.